Margaret Dawson had always believed that respect within a family was built through kindness, patience, and quiet sacrifice. For years, she had opened her home and her heart without asking for much in return. After losing her husband, she continued living in the cozy three-bedroom house they had spent decades paying off together. Every corner of the place held memories of birthdays, Christmas mornings, and countless family dinners. When her 30-year-old son, Ryan, and his wife, Olivia, fell on difficult financial times, Margaret welcomed them without hesitation. They promised it would only be temporary while they saved enough money to rent a place of their own. A year later, nothing had changed. They still lived there without contributing toward the mortgage, groceries, or utility bills. Margaret told herself that family helped family, so she kept her concerns to herself. One quiet Tuesday morning, she stood in the kitchen preparing fresh coffee when Olivia walked in, scrolling through her phone with barely a glance in Margaret's direction. "I've got some exciting news," Olivia said casually. "My friends, Lily and Brianna, are moving in today." Margaret looked up in surprise. "Moving in?" she repeated. "Yeah," Olivia replied, examining her freshly painted nails. "Their apartment lease ended and they need somewhere to stay until they get settled. They'll be here for a while." Margaret waited for Ryan to explain that his wife was joking, but he remained silent near the refrigerator, avoiding eye contact. "And where exactly will everyone sleep?" Margaret asked calmly. Olivia answered as though the decision had already been approved. "Well, Lily and Brianna have lots of belongings, so they'll take the master bedroom. Ryan and I will stay where we are, and you can sleep on the couch. Honestly, you hardly spend much time in your room anyway." For several seconds, the room became completely silent. Margaret stared at her daughter-in-law, trying to understand how anyone could say something so outrageous without the slightest embarrassment. Her own bedroom, the room she had shared with her late husband, the room inside the home she alone owned. Ryan finally muttered, "Mom, it'll only be for a little while." That single sentence hurt more than Olivia's demand. He hadn't defended her. He hadn't reminded his wife whose house this was. Instead, he expected his own mother to quietly surrender the last private space she had left. Oddly enough, Margaret didn't feel angry. She felt something colder. It was the unmistakable feeling that a line had finally been crossed. Without raising her voice, she smiled gently. "All right," she said. Olivia's face brightened instantly. "I knew you'd understand. You're seriously amazing." She grabbed her handbag. "The girls and I are going out for brunch first. We'll bring everything over this afternoon." Within moments, both Olivia and Ryan left the house. The front door closed behind them. Margaret remained standing alone in the kitchen. The peaceful silence felt different now. Instead of sadness, she experienced complete clarity. She reached for her phone. Her first call was to a locksmith. Her second was to a professional moving company. Less than half an hour later, an experienced locksmith replaced every exterior lock on the house, while Margaret watched quietly from the hallway. Shortly afterward, 3 movers arrived carrying stacks of sturdy boxes and rolls of packing material. Margaret greeted them politely. "I only need you to pack the belongings in the guest bedroom and bathroom," she explained. "Everything belongs to my son and his wife. Please handle it carefully." The workers nodded and immediately began wrapping clothing, electronics, shoes, cosmetics, books, and personal items with impressive efficiency. Margaret followed behind them, making sure nothing was damaged. She wasn't acting out of revenge. She wasn't trying to destroy anyone's property. She simply wanted her house back. As the movers worked, Margaret rented a secure climate-controlled storage unit nearby and paid 3 months in advance. She wanted every detail handled properly. No accusations, no misunderstandings. Everything would be documented. By early afternoon, every trace of Ryan and Olivia had disappeared from the house. The movers loaded the final box into their truck before handing Margaret a complete inventory list. She thanked them sincerely. Once they drove away, she placed the storage key, payment receipt, inventory sheet, and facility address into a clear envelope. Using strong tape, she attached the envelope directly to the front door where it couldn't possibly be missed. For the first time in over a year, the house felt peaceful again. Margaret opened every window, filled a bucket with warm water and pine-scented cleaner, and slowly began washing the hardwood floors. As the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, she smiled. Quietly. She wasn't taking revenge. She was reclaiming the home she and her husband had built together. One room, one decision, and one peaceful moment at a time. Margaret had just finished polishing the dining table when the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times. The quiet rhythm of the house soothed her, something she hadn't truly experienced since Ryan and Olivia had moved in. At exactly 4:15 that afternoon, her phone buzzed. "Ryan, Mom, the front door won't open. Did something happen to the lock?" Margaret glanced at the screen but didn't answer. A minute later, another message arrived. "Olivia, why isn't the key working?" Then came another. "Ryan, please call us." Margaret calmly turned her phone face down and continued reading the mystery novel she'd been meaning to finish for weeks. Outside, tires crunched against the driveway. She walked quietly to the living room window and gently lifted the edge of the curtain. The scene unfolded exactly as she'd expected. Ryan stood frozen near the front steps with a confused expression. Olivia paced back and forth, waving her arms dramatically, while Lily and Brianna waited beside several large suitcases, exchanging nervous glances. Olivia spotted the clear envelope taped to the front door. She snatched it down and quickly read the contents. Her expression changed from confusion to outrage. Ryan looked at the paperwork, then slowly lifted his head toward the house. Seconds later, Margaret's phone rang again. This time she answered. "Hello?" "Mom," Ryan exclaimed. "What's going on? Why did you change the locks?" "I had every one of your belongings professionally packed," Margaret replied evenly. "They're stored safely in a climate-controlled facility. I've already paid 3 months of storage fees. The address and key are inside the envelope." For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Olivia grabbed the phone. "You've lost your mind," she shouted. "You threw us out." Margaret remained calm. "I didn't throw anyone out. What do you call this, then? I ended a temporary arrangement that had gone far beyond its welcome." "You can't do that," Olivia yelled. "We live here." Margaret took a slow breath. "No," she answered firmly. "I live here. You were guests who decided to invite 2 additional people into my home without asking me. Guests who expected me to give up my bedroom so strangers could enjoy the master suite." Olivia's breathing grew heavier. "We had nowhere else to go. You have your vehicle, your personal belongings, and 3 months of paid storage. I'm confident 4 capable adults can find a solution together." Ryan finally spoke again. "Mom, please, can't we just talk about this?" "We already had that conversation," Margaret replied softly. "It happened the moment neither of you asked how I felt about being moved onto my own couch." Silence filled the line. Margaret continued. "I wish you both well, but this chapter is over." She ended the call before either of them could respond. Then she switched off the doorbell chime, made herself a cup of chamomile tea, and settled comfortably into her favorite chair. Outside, Olivia continued shouting. Margaret no longer felt obligated to listen. That night, she stretched across her own bed, enjoying the simple comfort of sleeping peacefully without footsteps echoing through the hallway or loud television noise filling the house. The following morning began with birds singing outside her bedroom window. She prepared breakfast at her own pace, savoring every quiet moment. After washing the dishes, she sat at her computer. There was one final responsibility she needed to address. Years earlier, Margaret had added Ryan as an authorized user on one of her secondary bank accounts in case of emergencies. At first, he rarely touched it. Recently, however, she had noticed frequent restaurant charges, online shopping purchases, entertainment subscriptions, and other unnecessary expenses. She logged into her banking account. Within minutes, she transferred every remaining dollar into her personal account, removed Ryan's authorization, and canceled the supplementary credit cards connected to her finances. The process was surprisingly quick. More importantly, it marked the end of years of financial dependence. Around lunchtime, her younger sister Diane called. "Margaret," she said carefully, "Olivia phoned me this morning. She claims you suddenly threw them onto the street." Margaret didn't argue. Instead, she opened the message Olivia had sent the previous day. It clearly stated that Lily and Brianna would take the master bedroom while Margaret slept on the living room couch. She forwarded the screenshot to Diane. A few minutes later, her sister replied, "I had no idea that's what really happened." Margaret smiled faintly. Sometimes facts spoke louder than emotions. Not long afterward, Ryan called again. His voice sounded exhausted. "Mom, my debit card isn't working anymore." "No," Margaret answered gently. "It isn't. We don't even have enough money for groceries. Margaret paused before speaking. Ryan, you're a grown man with a wife. It's time the two of you begin building your own life instead of depending on mine. She ended the call quietly. For the first time in many years, Margaret realized that protecting her peace wasn't selfish. It was simply long overdue. 2 peaceful days passed without interruption. Margaret found herself rediscovering the small routines she had once taken for granted. She watered the flowers in the backyard, reorganized her sewing supplies, and placed several family photographs back on the mantel after Olivia had packed them away months earlier to make room for decorative ornaments. The house finally felt like home again. Late that afternoon, her phone chimed with a notification from the security camera installed beside the front door. She glanced at the screen. It wasn't Ryan or Olivia. Standing on the porch were Lily and Brianna. Both women folded their arms impatiently while repeatedly pressing the doorbell. Margaret walked to the hallway and activated the intercom. "Can I help you?" Lily stepped closer to the camera. "Mrs. Dawson, we really need to talk." "I'm listening." Brianna sighed dramatically. "We ended our apartment lease because Olivia promised we could live here. Now we're stuck paying for a motel every night. This whole situation isn't fair." Margaret listened without interrupting. When they finished, she spoke calmly. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this, but I never invited either of you to stay here." "Olivia said it wasn't a problem," Lily insisted. "Olivia doesn't own this house." The women exchanged frustrated looks. "You have plenty of room," Brianna argued. "Why can't you just let us stay for a while?" Margaret smiled politely. "Because this is my home, and I decide who lives here." Lily's patience disappeared. "So you're just going to leave us homeless?" "No," Margaret answered. "The person who made that promise is responsible for finding you another place to live." Brianna shook her head. "You're being incredibly selfish." Margaret remained perfectly composed. "I believe asking a 65-year-old widow to give up her bedroom for strangers was selfish." Neither woman had an answer. Instead, Lily muttered something under her breath before turning away from the camera. Margaret ended the conversation and stepped toward the front hallway window. The 2 young women still lingered on the porch, clearly hoping she would eventually give in. She remembered the sprinkler system her late husband had installed years earlier. Walking to the control panel, she selected the front yard zone. Seconds later, several sprinkler heads rose from the lawn and released powerful streams of cold water across the walkway and porch. Lily gasped. Brianna shrieked as water soaked her expensive jacket. The 2 women hurried down the driveway, slipping across the wet sidewalk while desperately trying to shield themselves with their handbags. Margaret quietly switched the sprinklers off. She couldn't help smiling. The garden needed watering anyway. The following morning, another familiar face appeared outside, Ryan. He stood alone at the front door with his hands buried inside his coat pockets. His shoulders drooped with exhaustion. Margaret opened the door just enough for the security chain to stop it. "Hello, Ryan." He looked older than he had only a few days earlier. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. "Hi, Mom. What brings you here?" Ryan hesitated. "Could you please open the door?" Margaret gently shook her head. "The chain stays where it is." He lowered his eyes. "We finally rented a tiny apartment." "I'm glad to hear that. It isn't very nice." Margaret remained silent. After several moments, Ryan sighed deeply. "I don't understand why everything had to happen this way." She studied her son's face. "It didn't." He frowned. "The day Olivia announced that strangers would take my bedroom, you could have said one sentence." Ryan looked away. "You could have said, 'Mom, this is your house. We'll figure something else out.'" "I know. But you didn't." "I didn't want another argument." Margaret nodded slowly. "And avoiding an argument was more important than protecting your mother." Ryan's voice became almost a whisper. "I thought you'd go along with it." "I always have," Margaret replied. "That's exactly why you expected me to." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Margaret stepped away from the door and returned carrying a small cardboard box. She carefully passed it through the opening. Ryan opened it. Inside lay several childhood photo albums along with his late father's wristwatch. His eyes filled with emotion. "I couldn't send these to storage," Margaret said softly. "They belong with you." Ryan held the watch in both hands. "I don't deserve this." "No," Margaret answered honestly, "but your father would have wanted you to keep it." Tears gathered in Ryan's eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom." Margaret believed he meant it. Still, forgiveness didn't erase consequences. She offered him a gentle smile. "I hope you build a good life, Ryan, one that stands on your own feet." He nodded silently. As he walked back toward the sidewalk, Margaret closed the door and locked it once more. For the first time, she sensed that her son had finally begun learning the difference between entitlement and gratitude. Ryan's visit lingered in Margaret's thoughts for only a short while. She'd spent too many years putting everyone else's needs ahead of her own, and she wasn't willing to return to that life. The following afternoon, she stood in the middle of her living room, studying the oversized gray sectional sofa. Olivia had insisted on buying it months earlier, claiming it would make the house feel more modern. Ironically, it was the very couch she had expected Margaret to sleep on after giving away her bedroom. Margaret smiled to herself. "It has served its purpose," she murmured. She picked up her phone, snapped a few clear photographs, and created an online listing. Practically new sectional sofa. Excellent condition. $75. First buyer takes it today. Within an hour, a young couple arrived in an old pickup truck. They admired the sofa with excitement. "We've been searching for something exactly like this," the husband said with a grin. Margaret helped them move it through the patio doors. As they drove away, she folded the $75 and slipped it into her wallet. The empty space in her living room felt surprisingly refreshing. That same afternoon, she visited a local furniture store. Instead of another oversized sofa, she purchased a comfortable olive green reading chair with a matching footstool. It was elegant, cozy, and perfectly sized for one person. When the delivery crew placed it beside the living room window, Margaret settled into it with a novel and a warm cup of tea. It felt like the perfect symbol of her new beginning. That evening, her phone notified her of a new email. The sender was Olivia. Margaret hesitated before opening it. The message began with an apology, but the further she read, the less sincere it sounded. Olivia claimed everything had been misunderstood. She insisted that suggesting the couch had only been a joke. She wrote that Margaret had overreacted because she was lonely, and explained that if Margaret truly cared about family, she would help them pay the security deposit on their new apartment. Margaret quietly laughed, not because the situation was amusing, but because she finally recognized the pattern. The apology wasn't about regret, it was about money. Without replying, she marked the email as spam and permanently deleted it. Some conversations no longer deserved a response. A few days later, another challenge arrived. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from an unfamiliar family group chat. Olivia's relatives had somehow obtained Margaret's number. One message after another filled the screen. "Family should forgive. You shouldn't treat your own son this way. Everyone deserves a second chance." Margaret read every message carefully. Then she calmly gathered 2 photographs. The first showed Olivia's text ordering Margaret to give up her bedroom. The second displayed the receipt proving she had paid 3 months of storage fees for all of Ryan and Olivia's belongings. She posted both images into the group. Beneath them, she typed only one sentence. "Since family should always sacrifice for one another, I'm sure one of you will gladly offer your master bedroom to Ryan and Olivia." She pressed send. Almost immediately, the conversation fell silent. No one responded. Margaret smiled, exited the group, blocked every unfamiliar number, and returned to her peaceful afternoon. Later that evening, she stepped outside to water her roses. Her next-door neighbor, Mr. Carter, looked over from his garden. "You seem happier these days," he observed. Margaret smiled warmly. "I finally remembered something important." "And what's that?" "Kindness should never require giving away your self-respect." Mr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "That's wisdom most people learn too late." Over the next 3 weeks, life settled into a comforting routine. Margaret joined her neighborhood book club again. She planted fresh herbs in the backyard. She transformed Ryan's former bedroom into a bright reading and sewing room filled with natural sunlight. For the first time in years, every room reflected her own taste instead of someone else's preferences. Then, one crisp autumn morning, she discovered an envelope inside her mailbox. The handwriting immediately caught her attention. It belonged to Ryan. Inside was a handwritten note and a check for $250. "Mom, I started working evenings after my regular job. I know this isn't enough to repay everything you've done for us, but it's a beginning. I'm sorry for taking you for granted. I hope one day I can earn back your trust." Margaret read the letter twice. There were no excuses, no blame, no requests, just accountability. She carefully folded the note and placed it inside her desk drawer. The check remained uncashed. It wasn't about the money, it was about Ryan learning responsibility through his own efforts. That evening, Margaret sent him a short message. "I'm proud that you're taking responsibility. Keep moving forward and take care of yourself." It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was the first honest step toward D1. As the weeks turned into months, the silence inside Margaret's home no longer felt unfamiliar. It had become a source of comfort. Every morning she woke naturally instead of being disturbed by slammed doors or loud conversations. She drank her coffee beside the front window, watched the birds gather in the garden, and appreciated the simple rhythm of a peaceful life. Winter arrived gently, dusting the neighborhood with frost and bringing crisp mornings that made the fireplace especially inviting. Margaret spent her days reading, sewing, and hosting her monthly book club. The spare bedroom had become her favorite retreat, filled with shelves of novels, baskets of yarn, and the antique sewing machine her husband had restored years earlier. One Friday evening, several friends gathered at her home for tea and conversation. They laughed over stories, discussed their latest novel, and admired the cozy reading room Margaret had created. As the last guest left, she locked the front door behind them. The solid click of the deadbolt brought an unexpected smile to her face. Months earlier, that sound had symbolized the painful end of one chapter. Now it represented safety, independence, and peace. A few days later, Ryan called. His voice sounded stronger than it had in months. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, Ryan. I wanted to tell you something. I'm listening." "I received a promotion at work." Margaret smiled. "Congratulations." "I couldn't have done it before." "What changed?" Ryan hesitated before answering. "I finally realized how much you were carrying for me. When everything disappeared at once, I had no choice but to grow up." Margaret remained quiet. "I blamed you at first," Ryan admitted. "It was easier than admitting I had failed to stand up for you. Looking back, I understand why you made the decision you did. Those words meant far more than another apology. They showed understanding." "I hope you're happy," Ryan continued. "I am." "I miss visiting," Margaret answered honestly. "I miss the son who used to visit because he wanted to spend time with me, not because he needed something." Another brief silence followed. "I want to become that person again," Ryan said softly. "I hope you do." Several weeks later, Ryan stopped by unexpectedly. This time he arrived alone. He carried a small potted orchid in one hand and a homemade apple pie in the other. When Margaret opened the door, she noticed the difference immediately. He wasn't asking to come inside. He wasn't assuming he was welcome. He simply smiled. "I brought these for you. They're lovely. I'll leave them here if you're busy." Margaret looked at her son for a long moment. The tired, entitled young man who had once stood silently while his wife claimed his mother's bedroom seemed to have disappeared. Standing before her was someone humbler, someone who had learned difficult lessons. She stepped aside. "You can come in for a cup of coffee." Ryan's eyes widened slightly. "I'd like that." They spent nearly 2 hours talking, not about money, not about Olivia, not about the past. Instead, they shared memories of Ryan's father, laughed about old family vacations, and discussed the books Margaret had been reading. Before leaving, Ryan paused near the front door. "Thank you for giving me another chance." Margaret shook her head gently. "I gave you an opportunity. Earning trust takes time." "I understand." As he walked toward his car, Margaret realized something important. Forgiveness did not require forgetting. It did not require pretending the hurt had never happened. True forgiveness simply meant refusing to let yesterday's pain control tomorrow's peace. That evening, Margaret settled into her olive green reading chair with a blanket across her lap and a novel in her hands. She glanced around the room. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every decoration reflected the life she had chosen for herself. No one could make decisions for her anymore. No one could treat her like a guest in her own home. She had discovered that love without boundaries eventually becomes sacrifice, without appreciation. But love, supported by self-respect, creates healthier relationships for everyone involved. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, while soft snowflakes drifted beneath the porch light. Margaret closed her book and smiled. Her house was quiet, her heart was lighter, and for the first time in many years, she understood that protecting her dignity had never been an act of cruelty. It had been an act of courage. As she switched off the lights and climbed the stairs, she paused for a moment outside her bedroom. She opened the door, looked around the peaceful room she and her husband had once shared, and whispered a quiet thank you for the strength to reclaim the life they had built together. Then she slipped beneath the warm blankets, listening to the comforting silence surrounding her. It wasn't simply the absence of noise. It was the sound of a woman who had finally remembered her worth and who would never again allow anyone to take it away.